Welcome to Runegistics. I make fast guides here designed to help you accomplish an old school RuneScape goal or task as quickly and efficiently as possible. Today's walkthrough is for the Giant's Foundry and will cover requirements, getting there, objectives, suggested inventory, mechanics, and rewards. So listen, Giant's Foundry is very simple. So much that you can easily expect to complete this minigame as soon as you finish its prerequisite quest, Sleeping Giants. Feel free to utilize the chapters in the video timeline to navigate to whichever section of information you are interested in. So the Giant's Foundry, the solution to having no more Blast Furnace runs, right? Well, not exactly. Blast Furnace is still a lot more experience per hour, but the Giant's Foundry is definitely a formidable substitute, especially when it comes to lower levels and the amount of gold you get from it. I would definitely recommend this minigame to anyone because it is extremely fast, can be used to get rid of all your unnecessary armor pieces, and gives a very generous amount of GP. Not to mention, the smithing set is grade A drip. So let's get into it. Before attempting the Giant's Foundry, all you need is completion of the quest Sleeping Giants, which requires 15 smithing. That quest is extremely short and really only exists to introduce you to the minigame. That's all you really need aside from the materials that go into the game. More on that soon though. There's multiple ways of getting to the Giant's Foundry east of Valkyrie, where the minigame is located. Personally, I just use the grouping teleport, which is always available and very easy. If for some reason you left and needed to get back or it's on cooldown, you could use a Ring of Dueling or Amulet of Glory to get you relatively close. Giant's Foundry is honestly one of the easiest minigames available today. The objective is simple: craft a sword for Kovacs, the giant that runs the foundry, to the highest possible quality you can get, alternating between 5 different tasks: heating and cooling the sword, and using 3 different tools to shape the sword preform. We'll cover these in detail in the mechanics section, but these 5 tasks work in tandem with the refinement HUD specific to Giant's Foundry. Harmonizing these 5 tasks with the HUD is all you have to do. Here's the map layout of the Giant's Foundry. It's a pretty small cave, and all the necessary elements are packed into it to make running around relatively quick and easy. Right inside the entrance is Kovacs, who provides you with commissions, which is basically just the type of sword you need to make. He also serves as the rewards vendor for this minigame, and is the person you turn the sword into when you're done. Right next to Kovacs is the sword mold setup, where you will select different mold types to be used when crafting your sword. More on this later. Right above the mold is the Crucible, where you place your metal to be melted down for crafting, and a bank chest to easily access those metal bars or equipment pieces. Slightly northwest of the bank is the Preform storage. The storage serves as a way to pause the minigame and store your active sword for later, saving all of your progress. And in the bottom left corner we have a pile of buckets, since a bucket of water or ice gloves are necessary to cool down the hot preform before picking it up. Those are basically the ancillary points of interest here, with the 5 remaining elements being the tasks I mentioned earlier. So let's talk a little bit more in detail about the elements and the mechanics. Being that I'm a chemical and materials engineer by trade in real life, I'm very proud of how Jagex actually made this minigame. It's relatively close to the concepts of basic metallurgy. The idea of heating, shaping, and cooling alloyed metals is something I'm glad they took the time to research and implement. The mechanics of Giant's Foundry can really be summed up in one sentence: utilize the lava pool and waterfall to heat and cool your preformed sword to a temperature that coincides with hammering, grinding, or polishing it. So let's explain that. First of the 8 active elements in this minigame is the mold jig, where you will input 3 pieces of a sword mold that correlate to the specific commission that Kovacs gives you. This, along with the Crucible and what bars to put in, are where a lot of people get confused. I'll make this short and simple. Kovacs is going to give you a random combination of 2 of 5 different styles to make your sword preform with. These 5 styles are broad, light, heavy, spiked, and flat. Depending on what he gives you, your job is to choose the best 3 possible fork, blade, and tip combinations of molds from your mold library to make that sword. Each mold available gives certain bonuses to the overall sword preform, and these bonus points add up to boost the final quality of your sword. Sword quality directly correlates to the amount of XP, GP, and points you get when you turn the sword in, so you absolutely always want to use the best possible mold. This may seem like a puzzle, but let's skip all of that and state the obvious. All you need to do is select the mold that gives you the most points. Simple addition of the 2 commission styles will help you decide that. Here's a quick example. So here Kovacs asked for a narrow light sword. Looking at my tip options, I immediately see 3 major choices: the needle point, serrated tip, and corrupted point. The needle point gives 18 narrow and 3 light commission bonuses. The serrated tip gives 4 narrow and 16 light. And the corrupted point gives 8 narrow and 10 light. That's a total of 21 points for the needle point, 20 for the serrated tip, and 18 for the corrupted point. So naturally, I'll choose the needle point here. For the blade, I have the serpent blade with 18 total points, the flamberge blade with 16 total points, and the stiletto blade with 14. So I'll go with the serpent blade here. And for the fort, I have the stiletto fort at 18 and the serpent ricasso at 14. So I'll choose the stiletto fort here. This gives me a total of 36 points to the narrow commission and 21 for the light commission. As you can see, it's really that easy. One final note on the mold choices: when you start doing the Giants Foundry, you'll quickly notice that you were given some really lackluster default molds to choose from. In fact, you have 0 possible mold combinations that could be considered optimal. That's because as part of the reward for Giants Foundry, you have the option to purchase molds to permanently add to your mold library. I'll get more into this during the rewards section, but let me just say this now. You absolutely need to buy the molds as they become available to you. The quality of your sword increases immensely as you unlock the high level molds, which results in higher overall throughput as you play this minigame. As enticing as the designer level smithing outfit can look, and thought of smithing 8 cannonballs at a time may sound, trust me, they can wait. The next major element that can cause confusion is the Crucible, where you add your metal to form your Preform. The Crucible needs 28 total metal bars before you can pour it into your mold jig, which can be made up of both metal bars and metal armor pieces. Metal bars input into the Crucible in a 1-to-1 ratio, meaning if you put in 14 mithril bars, it counts as 14. Armor pieces count as 1 less than the amount of bars it took to smith them, meaning if I put in 1 mithril plate body into the Crucible, that's going to count as only 4 mithril bars, since it took me 5 to smith that item. Basically, the whole point is to throw whatever you want to make the total bar count equal 28. Just be sure to make sure that it equals 28, because if not, it will let you know that you are exceeding the 28, which it will still accept that, but you will lose any excess bars you're contributing at that time. Meaning if I have 26 bars in my Crucible right now and I put in that mithril plate body I mentioned earlier, it's going to go up to 28, but I'm going to lose 2 extra bars because there's 4 total available from the mithril plate body. At any point, you can also empty the Crucible, which will cause you to lose any items or bars you put in there. So be careful of that as well. You can always check on how many bars you have accumulated into the Crucible by right-clicking it and selecting the check option. The part that is very confusing for some with the Crucible is how many of each type of metal to put in. I personally love that this plays a role, because it actually takes into account the chemical and material properties behind metal alloys. But I'm a huge nerd, so I digress. Basically, to make this simple, the quality of your final sword is determined based on 2 factors: your metal score and your mold score. Add these 2 numbers up and you get your initial sword quality, which is that big gauge on the top of the HUD. I'll talk about the mold in the next element. For the metal score, the easiest way to explain it is that when inputting metal into the Crucible for the Giants Foundry, alloys are what give you the highest metal score. How do we know this? Because there's a cute little variable equation on the wiki to determine the metal score, which when you dumb it down by using some algebra, it's just the number of bars for each type of metal added up along with the product of the number of both of those bars, all multiplied by a magical Jagex constant made up of fairy dust and regrets about EOC. Anyway, what does this all mean? Well, as we have all learned, sword quality is super important because it is directly tied to your rewards at the end. However, another variable to all this is the existence of something called alloy tiers. This isn't important when it comes to the rewards at the end, but it is important because it directly ties to the total number of sections you have to do for any sword in the minigame. Basically, depending on your metal score, your sword will be placed in what's called an alloy tier, which directly correlates to how many different tool activities you have to perform on that sword. There are 5 different alloy tiers. The lowest is from a metal score of 10 to 19 and only has 3 sections to complete. Then from 20 to 59, you have 4 sections, 60 to 89 has 5, 90 to 119 has 6, and 120 to 130 has 7. Why is this important, you may ask? Well, think of it like this. The trip hammer, grindstone, and polishing wheel all take around the same amount of time to complete a full section, about 40 seconds or so. Let's assume you threw 14 mithril bars and 14 addy bars into the Crucible. That's an initial metal score of 95, which is the high alloy tier, and will have 6 total tool activity sections. Now let's assume instead of 14 of each bar, you did 19 mithril bars and 9 addy bars. That's now a metal score of 89, a little bit less than what we just did. However, you might notice it's conveniently right inside of the medium alloy tier, and it's only going to have 5 tool activity sections. All different metal alloy combinations work this way, and depending on what metals you are using, you should aim to go for the lowest alloy tier, because it makes completing the sword much faster, generating a larger amount of rewards per hour. The initial quality will be lower, yes, but having to do one less section every time is so much more advantageous and saves you so much time. So, to sum up the Crucible, you should always approach it this way. Always use 2 different metals, preferably ones that are sequential to one another in smithing requirement. Something like bronze and iron and steel, steel and mithril, you get the idea. To optimize your time, inputting 19 of the lower grade metal into the Crucible and 9 of the higher grade metal into the Crucible is optimal. Doing this will always give you a lower alloy score and will require less tool sections and therefore less time to complete that sword. Listen, I know this is a lot and I could have just said use 19 and 9, but anyone around this channel for a while now knows I'm not interested in just regurgitating information from other guides or wikis. I actually want whoever sees this to grasp the concept of the minigame, so they don't have to rewatch this a million times. Alright, those are the 2 hard things to understand. Now let's do the easy ones. The next 2 elements are the lava pool and waterfall. The lava pool is where you heat your preform sword up, moving the temperature gauge of the HUD to the right the longer you keep dunking it. There are 2 right-click options for the lava pool: heating the preform and dunking it. Heating causes the temperature gauge to slowly move to the right, while dunking causes it to move much more quickly. Typically, when I'm heating my preform, I dunk whenever I first get there, then quickly left-click when I'm near the final few ticks needed to reach my desired temperature range. Once you fiddle around with this system, you'll see it's really all about timing and doing it in a manner that you feel most comfortable with. The opposite can be said to the waterfall, which cools your preform, moving the temperature gauge to the left. This operates exactly the same way as the lava pool, with a slower cool preform right-click option and a faster quench preform option. Just like the lava pool, I'm pretty content with quenching when I start cooling my preform, then using the cool option near the end. As a side note, naturally as you're refining your preform, the sword will very slowly cool down alongside all the different actions you are performing on it, which can be very problematic and you should at least be aware of. I'll cover this a little bit more during the walkthrough. Depending on what tool activity you need to do, your goal is to utilize these 2 elements in tandem to ensure your temperature gauge matches the activity gauge you are on. Speaking of tool activities, there are 3. The trip hammer, grindstone, and polishing wheel. The trip hammer requires a hot preform in the red temperature range, slowly cooling down the preform as you continue to use the trip hammer. This is the slowest of the 3 tools, causing your sword to gain progress every 5th game tick, versus only 2 ticks for the grindstone and the polishing wheel. The grindstone requires a medium temperature yellow preform and quickly heats up your preform as you use it. This means that it moves in the opposite direction of the trip hammer in respect to the temperature gauge, so just be aware of that. One of the more common mistakes I personally make is getting my preform into the yellow temperature right after it leaves the red one, then immediately grinding it, causing it to properly grind for 1 or 2 ticks, then move into the red, and immediately I realize I'm a complete shitter at this game. The last tool is the polishing wheel, requiring a cool green preform, which quickly cools your preform as you use it. It moves at the same speed as the grindstone, so just keep your eye on it. The final active element here is the preform storage, which I've already briefly discussed. It's very straightforward. At any point, you can put your preform in the storage to save your progress on the sword if you need to step away. Once you're ready to resume, just pick it back up from the storage location. And that's it. All you need to do is move through the different tool activities while in the corresponding temperature ranges until you have the sword completed. The last note here is for the quality gauge on the top of the HUD. Depending on the preform score and the metal score you initially had, the quality gauge will start with a certain amount in it. It will never go up, only go down if you make a mistake. This can include performing a tool activity tick in the wrong temperature or doing the wrong tool activity altogether. I've said it a million times now, quality directly correlates to your rewards at the end, so this should never go down. So that's pretty much all the elements, and there's only one major mechanic to watch out for, which is called the sweet spot. During your refinement process, at random times your HUD will suddenly have a yellowish border pop up around it. This is called the sweet spot. What this basically does is for the next 6 seconds, all you need to do is perform the tooling activity you're currently on to gain a very large amount of progress on your sword. This is extremely helpful. It can save you a lot of time, but it can also throw you off, because that large progress gain oftentimes will push you into the next section of your refinement. So when this does pop up, make sure to re-click your current refinement activity while also being cautious of where it's going to end up after the sweet spot tick occurs. As a note to this, you have to click on the tool for the sweet spot tick to register. You can't just keep using the tool if you already are. You'll know if you got the sweet spot tick to register because your border will turn green prior to the progress being made. Depending on how many sections of refinement you have to do, expect to see 3 sweet spots for 6 to 7 sections and 2 for anything less. To finish this section, all you need to do once you finish your sword is hand it in to Kovacs, where he will give you a very generous amount of smithing XP, GP, and some points to spend on the reward shop. You can then immediately choose to have another commission or wait. As a note, there is no wait on how long it takes you to complete your sword. All that matters at the end of the day in this minigame is the quality of the sword. Speaking of rewards, Giant's Foundry has your very standard setup for rewards. A smithing centric outfit that looks honestly absolutely amazing, some consumables to help you boost your smithing level, and most importantly, a godsend of a double ammo mold, which can smith 8 cannonballs at once. I can't begin to explain how helpful this is, and anybody who does Slayer already knows this. You can also buy the Berserk sword here, which is pretty neat too, right? As I said before, just based on my experience with this minigame, I would hold off on getting these items in lieu of unlocking the Preform molds, which will be automatically added to your mold library. These molds are absolutely paramount in increasing your initial sword quality, sometimes giving you around 40 to 50% higher starting quality depending on the commission. Think of it like this: when you first start Giant's Foundry, you get the free-to-play molds. All of the DLC content and pay-to-play and fun part of Giant's Foundry exists within the molds that you buy from the shop. They're so important and they cannot be underestimated. It makes a huge difference and is well worth the investment. Alright, so let's walk through an example of completing a commission in the Giant's Foundry. For this example, I'm just wearing a full graceful outfit, save wearing a pair of ice gloves, which you need to pick up the preform after pouring the metal into the Crucible. If you don't have ice gloves, you'll need to grab a bucket from the nearby pile and fill it with water from the waterfall right behind you. Then use the bucket of water on the mold after pouring your metal into it. Aside from that, you don't really need anything else. So we'll start by getting a commission assigned from Kovacs, which he wants a broad light sword. I'll immediately go to my mold jig and select the best options for this commission, which are Stiletto Fort, Claymore Blade, and Serrated Tip. This is a pretty ugly commission combination, I'm not gonna lie, but I mean, that's just the way she goes, man. Once I have my mold jig set up, I'll run over to the bank chest and grab my bars. As we've discussed, the optimal choice here is to use 2 different metals with 19 of the lower grade and 9 of the higher grade, as it will result in 1 less tool activity to complete. For this example, I'm using 19 mithril bars and 9 addy bars. So I'll grab my bars and throw them into the Crucible, after which I'll then pour them into the mold jig. Once that's done, I'll run over to the mold jig and pick up my preform. At this point, it's time to start actually processing the sword. A good tip at the start is you almost always start with the trip hammer being your first activity to do. Because of this, you can always expect your first action to be cooling your preform via the waterfall, which you'll see me doing right here. It doesn't need much to get into the red temperature range, and as we use the trip hammer, it will slowly cool down, so we want it on the right hand side of the red temperature range at the start to maximize the amount of trip hammer ticks we can do. I'll process this through the trip hammer until either I finish this tool activity section or the temperature gauge moves out of the red. A good tip to note, typically unless you have a sweet spot proc, almost all activities will require you to reheat or recool your preform 1 time. You'll also notice me do this a lot, which is hovering my mouse to the next area I know I'm going to need to go to. This is likely something you are going to pick up over time as well. Being proactive is definitely a really helpful trait to have in this minigame. So instead of chancing the temperature gauge moving out of the red here, I chose to reheat it just a little bit in the lava pool to avoid accidentally using the trip hammer outside of the red range, which would result in a loss on the quality of my sword. So I reheat it just a little bit and finish up the first trip hammer activity. After finishing that section, I see the next section is the Grindstone, which needs a yellow temperature and will move to the right as I use it. Because of this, I want to cool my preform using the waterfall all the way to the left hand side of the yellow temperature gauge. Once I have that done, I'll move to the Grindstone and continue processing. While processing, I see that I got a sweet spot proc, meaning that I should click on the Grindstone again to activate it and get a good chunk of completion on my sword. However, I also noticed that this will likely put me really close, if not over, to ending this Grindstone activity. So I'm going to click it, but also be ready to click off as soon as possible, just in case that tick pushes me over. Which sure enough, it was literally just enough to move it into the next activity section, which is the polishing wheel. This requires a green temperature range and causes the gauge to move to the right. So what I want to do here is cool the preform at the waterfall until it is in the right hand side of the green temperature range. Once I do that, I'll begin processing on the polishing wheel. As stated before, if you don't get a sweet spot, you'll likely need to reheat or cool 1 time during each activity, which you'll notice I have to do here. Once I finish the polishing wheel, it's back to the grindstone, meaning I want the temperature gauge on the left side in the yellow. So I'll heat my preform there and begin grinding again. I need to cool it off one time, then finish up and move to the last tool activity, which is trip hammering. The gauge wants to be on the right hand side of the red temperature range, so I'll heat it up here and begin hammering. Luckily, since I had 5 sections for this sword and I've only seen one sweet spot, I know I'm gonna get another one here, meaning I won't need to reheat my sword before finishing. Which, as you can see, it does happen, and I'm able to finish the sword off. Lastly, I'll just turn this sword into Kovacs and get my reward, which is about 12,500 smithing XP, 25k GP, and some reputation points for the shop. As you can see, the sword was done in exactly 5 minutes and 19 seconds, which is about the average for any sword with this mini section. As stated earlier, each section takes about 40 seconds or so, give or take, so you could do the math to figure out how long it would take to process 4, 6, or 7 section swords. And that's really it. I mean, like I've said too many times now, this is a really easy minigame, but it definitely has a few tricks to make it easier. Just some real talk before we go. Honestly, I think the best part of Giants Foundry is the early game GP potential. Keep in mind the only prerequisite for this minigame is completing Sleeping Giants, which requires 15 smithing. You can get 15 smithing literally within a couple of hours of starting the game. Just for kicks, I did a few runs of Giants Foundry making swords with 19 bronze and 9 iron bars. Since that's the lowest level alloy combination, it can literally be made at 15 smithing. I even used a bucket of water to cool the preform and default molds. The average time it took me to complete a sword was about 4 minutes and 18 seconds, and I got an average of 8,045 GP per sword. If you extrapolate that to an hour, it's still literally over 110,000 GP an hour. Literally fresh out the gate, man. Obviously, that number is tied to the fact that you have to smith the bars or armor pieces to run this minigame, but still, I feel like this should be the new go-to default early game money making method, especially for ironmen and low level or new players. Either way, if this video helped you out, feel free to leave a like, and as always, if you think there was any information that needed more time or a better explanation, let me know in the comments. Being a smaller creator, I do actually read everything you guys say, and it means a lot to me to see your thoughts. If you like this style of guide and want to see more on the other areas of OSRS, I invite you to subscribe to the channel. It's a small group here, but I'm sure it's going to keep growing. Thanks for tuning in, and I'll see you guys on the next one.